This programme has been edited since broadcast.
When I was at school in the late 60s, everyone doing the O-level English syllabus got to read 1984, George Orwell's story of Winston Smith, an everyman trapped in a totalitarian Britain ruled by Big Brother, Ingsoc and the Thought Police. It was, it seemed to me, deployed as the great warning of what could happen if the radical left, with its pro-state tendencies, were to come to power. 1984 was, in essence, a book the right hit the left over the head with. Which is odd, because George Orwell was himself, for most of his life, a man of the left. So how did it come about that Orwell the socialist wrote 1984, the Bible, almost, of the anti-socialists? To understand the 1984 conundrum, we have to go back before the coldest part of the Cold War, before even the Second World War. It's 1936. Hitler has been in power for 3 years, and in the Soviet Union, Stalin has been in power for a decade or more. But the General Secretary does not feel secure. Those in any way associated with his exiled rival, Leon Trotsky, are being purged and tried for their lives. What you're about to hear is not from 1984, it's a real Soviet broadcast in English.
The trial of the counter-revolutionary Trotsky wrecking group in the Kemerovo mines is over. The proletarian court has passed its severe and only possible sentence. All 9 defendants were sentenced to death.
The charges are absurd, yet most Russians, and many in Britain and elsewhere, choose to believe them. For people on the left, Russian communism is the great hope in the fight against fascism, and fascism is on the attack. General Franco is leading his insurgent fascist army against the embattled elected government of Spain.
Said that within a week the insurgents would attack Valencia, the seat of the Spanish
raids on Spanish government
4,000 or 5,000 metres up appeared 3 or 4 aluminium-coloured planes.
They had been tried and shot.
They were running away from bombers speeding along at 300 miles
that the insurgent air force has bombed and sunk a 2,500-ton steamer.
The mass panic that was caused as one raid
A Russian fighting plane has been found in the airport.
Into this moment when titanic ideologies clash, steps a jobbing journalist and minor novelist. George Orwell sets off to join the international volunteers who've gone to Spain to defend the Socialist Republic. Bob Edwards fought alongside Orwell and remembered his first sight of the writer at war.
I burst into hearty laughter. All 6'3" of him was striding towards me, and his clothing was grotesque, to say the least. He wore corduroy riding breeches, khaki puttees, and huge boots. I've never seen boots.
The experience of being in Spain was the crucial influence on his political development in the 1930s.
DJ Taylor, Orwell's biographer.
He says that it was in Barcelona for the first time that he saw what he imagined to be a democratically socialist society actually working.
Everybody in Spain received 10 pesetas a day. Every child got 10 pesetas a day. A mother, a widow, a worker, a general in the army, a captain, and the rank-and-file militiaman.
One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. Homage to Catalonia, 1938.
Barcelona, as he first saw it, was Orwell's political utopia, never to be glimpsed again. At the front, he and his comrades in a Trotskyist organisation called the POUM, or POUM, fought Franco's fascist forces. But Orwell discovered, almost to his amazement, that the fascists weren't his only enemy. Back in Barcelona, he found himself in peril from his supposed comrades in the struggle. The communists were out to crush the POUM and take control of the city. His wife Eileen was there working for the small independent Labour Party when everything changed.
When Sir Richard Rees, who was a friend of Orwell's, visited Eileen, he describes her in these words: she was in a very strange mental state. I realised afterwards she was the first person in whom I had witnessed the effects of living under a political terror.
Peter Davison, editor of Orwell's Complete Works.
What Orwell didn't know, and really no one knew till afterwards, was that before he'd even left England to come to Spain, Pravda had declared the POUM a fascist organisation and that it ought to be eliminated.
Some of Orwell's fellow British journalists were happy to help crush this sect of what they called wreckers and splitters. Claude Cockburn reported from Spain for the Daily Worker, the Communist Party's paper.
Any damage I could do them, I would do. Certainly. I had no bones about that at all. In the same way, I mean, after all, if you're prepared to shoot people with a gun, well then, as in my case, typewriters somewhat more mighty than the rifle. Of course, I used the typewriter for the same purpose.
Orwell survived the communist suppression of the POUM in the streets of Barcelona and returned to the front to face the fascists again. Early one morning, Frank Frankfurt was on guard alongside him.
He was talking, and of course it started to get light. Well, unfortunately, of course, he was silhouetted above the barricade, which was just a sandbag barricade, and there was a sudden shot, bang, down goes Orwell, and he was shot through the throat and carried away.
Even as he struggled to recover from the bullet wound, Stalinist squads were hunting Orwell and his fellow Trotskyist militiamen. More than one of his comrades was captured by the Purgers.
There was a particular event which I think upset him very greatly, was the death of Bob Smillie, a student from Glasgow University who'd left to fight and was much admired by Orwell. And he describes him as being thrown into a cell and dying like a neglected animal.
The arrests, raids, searchings were continuing without pause. Practically everyone we knew, except those who were still at the front, was in jail by this time. The police were even boarding the French ships that periodically took off refugees and seizing suspected Trotskyists. The sooner we left, the better.
Finally, a step ahead of their would-be persecutors, George and Eileen managed to catch a train to France and escape. Something big had happened. Orwell had gone to Spain aware of just one mortal enemy on the far right. He came back facing two. Fascism and Stalinist communism were the two faces of a totalitarianism that corrupted the human spirit. As Orwell headed home to England, he was already on the road to 1984. To Orwell's friends, like the writers Richard Rees and Malcolm Muggeridge, the effect on him was clear.
His experiences in Spain had taught him a lot that he didn't know before, and didn't at all like when he did know it, about communism and about Russia. But this did not in any way affect his social or his personal ideals. His socialism was like a religion.
He hated the communists for the monstrous way they behaved in Spain. He also hated the right wing.
Orwell's turn against communism did not make him, in his own mind, an enemy of socialism. He still wanted a world of 10 pesetas a day for everyone. He still loathed the British ruling classes. If late Barcelona had scarred him, early Barcelona still invigorated him. Socialism was possible.
In every country in the world, a huge tribe of party hacks and sleek little professors are busy proving that socialism means no more than a planned state capitalism with the grab motive left intact. But fortunately, there also exists a vision of socialism quite different from this. The thing that attracts ordinary men to socialism and makes them willing to risk their skins for it, the mystique of socialism, is the idea of equality. To the vast majority of people, socialism means a classless society, or it means nothing at all. And it was here that those few months in the militia were valuable to me, for the Spanish militias, while they lasted, were a sort of microcosm of a classless society.
That's from Orwell's account of his time in Spain, Homage to Catalonia, which, once written, he was finding hard to get published. The anti-Stalinism in the book alienated not just paid-up communists like Claude Cockburn, but left-wing publishers like Victor Gollancz and Kingsley Martin, the editor of The New Statesman, who saw Orwell's writings as true but unhelpful to the Republican cause and liable to be taken as propaganda against socialism. The fight against fascism, they thought, needed a united front, of which pro-Soviet communists were an indispensable part. Until, very suddenly, they weren't. On the 23rd of August 1939, it was announced that Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact. Up to this point, Orwell had been against supporting any British war with Germany, seeing it as one ruling class against another. But now the enemy was revealed as totalitarianism. DJ Taylor.
After the Soviet-German pact, he has this, what he described as this Dowskian conversion, and he comes downstairs, he describes and sees the newspapers and suddenly realises that he is a British patriot and that it's more important to fight than to have these equivocations. And so he takes the step, I think probably about a week before war was declared.
As the journalist and friend of Orwell's, John Kimchi, recalled for a series of arena documentaries broadcast in the real 1984, there were many on the left who did not initially back the Second World War.
It was very difficult for socialists to be still supporting the war, particularly if you were slightly left socialist. In the Labour Party you had pacifists who were against it. You had socialists like Orwell and so on who thought it was an imperialist war and were against it. The Communist Party was dead opposed to it. And you were always liable to be called an imperialist if you said one had to support the war.
Some communists, like Arthur Calder Marshall, were outraged by the party's volte-face, but he found party officials like Emil Burns had easily accommodated the new policy.
I couldn't accept the change of line which transformed the challenge to Hitler from a glorious anti-Nazi struggle to a capitalist war. But, said Emil Burns, aren't you on the side of the working class anymore? Yes, I answered, that's why I'm leaving the Communist Party.
Emil Burns, as it happens, was a mentor of my father's and his predecessor as Cultural Secretary of the British Communist Party, and few things caused more upset to party members than the handed-down decision to oppose the war.
Orwell, as ever, thought that left-wing orthodoxy was simply coiling itself up in knots.
Though Orwell himself might have discovered his inner patriot, he did not regard the British ruling classes as fit to prosecute the conflict. What was needed to defeat the Nazis was some kind of revolution.
He wrote a number of essays in which he tried to sort of convey what he thought about the English people. The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius is the great one, which was actually written as the Blitz was taking place above his head. And I think what he thought at that point was that the actual act of having to come together as a society, as a community in the military effort would inspire sufficient fellow feeling amongst the British people to make some kind of practical democratic socialism possible.
And then Orwell's Lion and Unicorn came out, and here was somebody who had never been accused of being a super patriot or pro-imperialist, suddenly arguing very cogently and very effectively that this was a war that had to be supported.
We cannot establish anything that a Western nation would regard as socialism without defeating Hitler. On the other hand, we cannot defeat Hitler while we remain economically and socially in the 19th century. The past is fighting the future, and we have 2 years, a year, possibly only a few months, to see that the future wins.
In many ways, it was a turning point for many people like myself. I felt it turned people around who had been against it and began to support the war. In my case, I felt it was a great shot in the arm. It gave me much greater confidence.
So, for a few months, it seemed to Orwell that war and socialism could come together. In the summer of 1940, a Nazi invasion seemed likely, and the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden called for a local defence volunteer force, a Home Guard. Orwell, desperate to fight but too sick for the army, joined up. He saw it as a revolutionary opportunity.
The communists, ILP and all their kind can parrot arm the workers, but they cannot put a rifle in the workers' hands. The Home Guard can and does. Tribune, 20th of December, 1940.
But the truth is that this was almost the last of the revolutionary Orwell. The Home Guard was not the poom, and his country, Britain, was now in a struggle for its very life, a struggle that occupied almost all thought and effort. Orwell gave lectures to his Home Guard comrades on street warfare, but they were hardly a people's militia, as his future publisher and fellow volunteer Fred Warburg recalled.
Orwell, except as a writer, was never a professional. He liked the amateur and he liked the inefficient. The Home Guard, particularly in the early days when it was a broomstick army and bottled grenades, was just what Orwell liked. The only snag with the Home Guard that he was absolutely convinced that three-quarters of the officers were either fascists or potential fascists. They were mostly local tradesmen, wine merchants, estate agents and so on, and they were no more fascist than I was.
Arguably, in Orwell's mind, Barcelona before the prospect of socialism was being eclipsed by Barcelona after, the danger of totalitarianism. And around this time, Orwell took a big step on the road to 1984. Enter Arthur Koestler.
Yes, it was after the Soviet Union.
Like Orwell, Koestler was a left-wing reporter who'd run into trouble in Spain. He was a communist and had been imprisoned by the fascists. Being held under daily threat that they would bump him off severely shook his tolerance for totalitarian rhetoric.
The experience in Spain, where I was sort of jailed and I thought they were going to bump me off, was that up to then, words like physical liquidation, execution, were abstract words. Reason of state justifies, the end justifies the means. Even a few innocents have to die. But when you hear it with your own ears, a chap being led out at night to execution at 2 o'clock in the morning.
But Koestler was also repelled by communist behaviour in Spain and, having left the party, set about writing one of the great anti-totalitarian novels, Darkness at Noon. D.J. Taylor says he was a critical influence on Orwell.
He reacted very strongly and positively to Darkness at Noon, Koestler's novel about the Moscow show trials. And in fact, he spends several pages, I seem to remember, of his essay on Koestler trying to work out why it is that the old Bolshevik confesses to things that he hasn't done. Which, of course, is the gravamen at the heart, I suppose, of these show trials, is that when you line up all these people who previously have been your allies, who previously have been cut from the same ideological cloth, how is it that they can be persuaded to admit to things which they patently didn't do?
In the example of the Trotskyists, who are the most beastly and naked agents of capitalism, we see once more the correctness and timeliness of Comrade Stalin's warning. Actually, there is no infamy and slander low enough for these hirelings of fascism.
Koestler's conclusion about all of this is that no revolution predicated on violence can ever succeed. And I think that's very important in terms of the way in which he was formulating his own thought, not only about the Western world, but about Britain itself in the 1940s and what might happen during the war and what might then happen after it.
To Orwell's disgust, many on the left and even many liberals had bought into Stalin's show trials.
This is also in his writing on Koestler, where he exclaims at almost the avidity of the British left to coil themselves up in these knots, to find themselves having to explain things, to defend things that were ultimately indefensible. And I think he adduces it almost as a kind of psychological thing, as a sort of psychological flaw, this endless urge to be able to have to rationalise what is so obviously the product of an autocratic mind.
And so Orwell and Koestler formed an embattled left opposition to left totalitarianism. Early in the war, their political isolation in Britain led them to hook up with a similar knot of beleaguered anti-Stalinists in America. I asked Hugh Wilford and Francis Stoner Saunders, each of whom has written a study of left thinkers and the Cold War, to tell me about this group, the New York Intellectuals.
It's a really interesting group, this Trotskyite group. A lot of them are working class, lower middle class kids, second generation immigrants to the States. Quite a lot of them are Jewish. And they all share, I think it's fair to say, this compulsion to fight and fence and argue. And the debates and arguments that they had are legendary as a result. You get this really kind of unique grouping, which belongs to this outcast heretical sect, Trotskyism, and has little or no impact in the 30s, but it prepares the ground and starts writing the template for the cultural debates of the 40s and particularly of the Cold War period.
Both Orwell and the New York Intellectuals came out of the 1930s experience of engaging with communism and then growing very violently disappointed with it after the revelations of the Moscow show trials and, of course, Orwell's experience in Spain. So they shared anti-Stalinism, but also a commitment to staying on the left. And Orwell wrote extensively for the Partisan Review, which was their sort of flagship journal. He contributed London letters on a regular basis, sort of briefing an American audience about the UK.
Orwell became particularly friendly by post with Dwight MacDonald, one of the Partisan Review editors. But there was an intellectual in the Partisan Review orbit who had a deeper, more troubling influence on Orwell, James Burnham. Forgotten today, Burnham was a major figure back then.
James Burnham was an American, again, from quite an upper-class background. He was educated at Princeton, studied also at Oxford. Rather sort of cool academic type. But like many other intellectuals in the US in the 30s, he travelled leftward during the Depression. He was an active participant in a number of Trotskyist organizations because Trotskyism was very strong on the American non-communist left, but eventually became disillusioned with Marxism and with Trotskyism around the time of the beginning of the Second World War.
Burnham became well known in 1941 with a book called The Managerial Revolution.
The managers, these administrators, experts, directing engineers, production executives, propaganda specialists, technocrats, are the only social group among almost all of whose members we find an attitude of self-confidence. They know they are indispensable in modern society.
This, recognisably, is one of the great ideas in Orwell's novel. The notion that the overlords of the future will not be charismatic dictators or democratic politicians, but managers and bureaucrats. In 1984, Big Brother, after all, may not actually exist, but the party certainly does.
The managerial revolution suggests that there will be 3 superpowers, all of which will be distinguishable for the fact that they are run by a minority who are interested only in power, and that the mob, the rest of us, are destined to be ruled by these people. And there can be a little bit of infiltration upwards, upward mobility from the proles, if you like, into the ruling class. But essentially, political behaviour is all about the pursuit of power.
The left had mainly thought in terms of a conflict between, capitalists and Labour prior to that point. Burnham thought that that had really ceased to be the most relevant social conflict, and that really now that the state had become so powerful, that managers who controlled it and who controlled industry were able to control all of society. And this was in Nazi Germany, this was in Stalinist Russia, it was also in the United States.
In Burnham's prophecy, with capitalism discredited and socialism unworkable, managers and bureaucrats motivated solely by the desire for power would rise to dominate the world's emerging superstates.
The economic map suggests dramatically what is probable on many other grounds, that the world political system will coalesce into 3 primary superstates, each based upon one of these 3 areas of advanced industry. This does not necessarily mean that the 3 superstates will be the United States, Germany and Japan as we know them today. New names may be used.
As Peter Davison and Francis Stoner Saunders suggest, Orwell was horrified but fascinated by Burnham's vision of a world where the only goal is exercising power.
And Orwell's complaint is that Burnham never stops to ask why people want power. He thought Burnham had tremendous gifts, but that he should ever have been able to admire the Nazis showed he lacked, and I think it's a lovely phrase, showed he lacked moral effort.
Burnham's world has no history. He has emptied history of all its specific, particular content, and he says, here we are. We have one motive, and this motive accounts for everything. And in that, Orwell says, no, you're wrong. And if you were right, this is what the world would look like. History doesn't exist in 1984. You just delete it. You just take a paragraph out, replace it, you make it up as you go along, you alter the textbooks. 1984 is not a prophecy, I don't think. I think it's a reaction to a set of prophecies.
The declaration by President Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill and Premier Stalin, after last week's Tehran conferences, is published this evening.
When in 1943 the Allied leaders met in Tehran to decide the shape of the world after the war, Burnham's vision seemed to be coming true, albeit with Stalin rather than Hitler dominant in Eurasia.
He first told Warburg he was thinking of writing the novel in 1943. After the Tehran conference in November, which discussed the dividing the world into 3,
taken from the east, west and south, with common understanding
But as well as his perception of the machinations of emerging foreign superpowers, Orwell's experience of power closer to home was beginning to shape the world of 1984. In 1943, Orwell was working at the BBC, broadcasting to India. His experience of a big bureaucratic organisation, and particularly of the censorship imposed by the Ministry of Information, are often thought to have laid the ground for Winston Smith's workplace in 1984, Minitrue, the Ministry of Truth. David Astor, editor of The Observer, was a friend of Orwell's. Desmond Hawkins worked with him at the wartime BBC.
Orwell was a man with a relatively short fuse and no great liking for censorship anyway. I mean, it was a fairly dirty word in most of our vocabularies. You had to have the two stamps, one for policy, one for security, to say that it had gone through the censorship before you could get to the microphone.
I felt when I later read 1984 that the contrast between his highly disciplined life in the BBC, working in this beehive of people, eating in the canteen, where I also used to meet him sometimes, in the canteen in the Oxford Street office of the BBC. And then the contrast of this of going home to his chickens in St John's Wood, that here was the physical basis for the description in 1984 of Mini-Truth with its canteen.
Back in 1941, the Nazis had invaded their supposed ally, the Soviet Union. Everyone was thrown into sudden handbrake turns. The Communist Party became the staunchest supporters of the war, and the British government now embraced the tyrant Stalin as Uncle Joe the Ally. As the Red Army bore the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, so the Russians metamorphosed from mostly bad to wholly good. And at the BBC, Orwell watched as the corporation played its part in this. In 1942, the presenter, the People's Northerner, Wilfred Pickles, popped up at a munitions factory to make a programme called Arms for Russia.
And now, as a tribute to the men who are using the arms we're making, the gallant men of the Great Red Army, I ask you to rise for the International.
There was a war to be fought, and even men like Churchill swallowed their scruples and in public cuddled up to the bear. Not Orwell, though. Michael Foot, later Labour leader, was then a journalist on the pro-war left-wing magazine Tribune and a friend of its editor, subsequently founder of the National Health Service, Labour MP Nye Bevan.
Well, I wasn't the editor of Tribune at the time, but I used to talk very much with Nye Bevan, who was, and the others who were associated with the paper. And sometimes they used to think that George Orwell would turn up every Monday with the most awkward and embarrassing idea for the editor to publish that week, and they had great arguments about it. And of course he was writing things which were extremely unpopular to the left, greatly to the honour of Nye Bevan, that he continued to publish him all through that period, particularly when you remember that, of course, several publishers had refused to publish him. He had a great battle to say what he wanted to say, in particular his criticism of Soviet Russia at a time when the whole of the press was almost ecstatic in their praise of them, and they didn't want to publish anything critical if it could be avoided.
But all this spurred Orwell on. Another of his friends, Julian Simons, recalled Orwell's attitude.
People were much too much conned by the Soviet war effort into taking a favourable view of the government of the Soviet Union. This was, of course, the reason for writing Animal Farm at that time.
And our firm belief that this cause can only have the one end: final victory for us all and happier relations and cooperation between our two countries in the future. Long live the Red Army!
In 1944, as the immense battles on the Eastern Front were fought out, Orwell found publishers simply didn't want to risk the unpopularity of publishing his tale of a farmyard revolution and its brutal betrayal by a pig identifiable as Joe Stalin.
Orwell finished writing Animal Farm, I suppose, 1943, 1944, this great satire of the Soviet Revolution, the revolution that betrayed itself, and had great trouble in getting it published. T.S. Eliot turned it down at Faber and Faber on the most implausible ground. It was turned down by Jonathan Cape, and we know, or we can very reasonably assume, that one of the reasons why British publishers were so chary was that they were advised it would not be in the national interest by a communist fellow traveller working in the Ministry of Information, a man called Peter Smollett. subsequently unmasked as a Soviet spy after the war.
You couldn't get that kind of anti-Stalinist material published. It was very difficult in that period. The official culture, if you like, was one in which Stalin was being protected.
Finally, Orwell took the manuscript to his Home Guard comrade, Fred Warburg.
I used to have lunch at a pub not far from the office, just off the Strand. And I'd been lunching there by myself. It was before the flying bombs had started. And I was just paid my bill, was going to go out, when Orwell rushed in. He'd got in his hand a very slim, slightly tatty, brown-covered typescript. He said, "Here you are, Fred, here you are." I said, "What is it?" I'd only been vaguely aware that he was writing a book. Well, he said, it's my new book. I said, "What's it called?" "Animal Farm." I said, "What's it about?" "Well," he said, "it's about a lot of animals who revolt against the farmer. And it's very anti-Russian. I don't think you're going to like it. I don't think you're going to like it."
Warburg did like it. So did the British public, and it became Orwell's first real popular success when it was finally published after the war. To people like his New York comrade Dwight MacDonald, his focus seemed to have shifted decisively from revolutionary hopes of equality to anti-communist despair, there being nothing to choose in the end between the corrupt revolution of the pigs and the brutal capitalism of the farmer they overthrew.
5th of December, 1946. Dear Dwight.
And yet Orwell insisted that this was not his intention.
I meant the moral to be that revolutions only effect a radical improvement when the masses are alert and know how to chuck out their leaders as soon as the latter have done their job. The turning point of the story was supposed to be when the pigs kept the milk and apples for themselves, Kronstadt. If the other animals had had the sense to put their foot down then, it would have been all right.
The general election. Here is the state of the parties up to 1 o'clock in detail. Conservatives 66, Labour 174, Liberals 4...
As the war ended, Labour won power with its first ever majority, something Orwell professed himself pleased by. Yet now he was at work on 1984, a book that would come to be seen as an attack on the tyranny of something called English socialism, and some of it's clearly based on the petty restrictions and admonitions of government during and after the war, as Julian Simons remembered.
The Labour government had, for example, there was a poster saying, "We work or want." And that kind of grim exhortation, as well as the exhortations not to be squanderbugs, that didn't please Orwell. He didn't care for that kind of sanctimonious tone or the slide rule planning of some members of the Labour government for their attitude that they really knew best.
Orwell didn't like some of what Labour did, and at Tribune, Tosco Fyvel encountered Orwell's disappointment with what it didn't do.
What he said is the Labour government should, in coming to power in 1945, should immediately have enacted 3 fundamental reforms. First of all, the abolition of Eton and all the other public schools, away with privileged education. Then the abolition of all titles, because he said England was sort of crushed by the whole aristocratic setup as by a generation of ghosts, and the abolition of the House of Lords.
Like the old Orwell, he was attacking Labour in print from the left, not the right. So what were his politics? David Astor recalled Orwell's odd mix of left-wing Labour allegiance and something close to libertarianism.
He didn't bother about political parties. He didn't really work for a party, although he certainly favoured a party, and he certainly favoured democratic socialism. I mean, the parliamentary socialism, such as the Labour Party under Attlee, so to speak, or an Aaron Bevan. But there was a delicate frontier there when you go over, and it becomes related to Eastern Europe and Marxists and so on, at which he stopped. He said that people had been most free, the individual men had been most free in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the United States, where there was no government and virtually no neighbours, and you could have a piece of ground yourself, and you weren't being overwhelmed by tribal authorities like primitive man, and there was no sort of imperialism would come and sit on you.
which sounds Tea Party-ish. And there seem to be fundamental contradictions in Orwell's political views. He hoped legislated equality and personal liberty could somehow coexist and thrive. Yet a closer look at Orwell's political journalism in the early post-war years, as he wrote the novel, does reveal an acute perception of where the world was heading.
Scientists, British and American, have made the atomic bomb at last. The first one was dropped on a Japanese city this morning.
One cataclysmic event that influenced Orwell in his novel, but which is rarely emphasised, was the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945.
They may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
In October 1945, just weeks after the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Orwell sat down to think through the implications. The A-bomb made James Burnham's prophecy of the rise of bureaucratic superstates all too imaginable. In a piece for Tribune, You and the Atom Bomb, Orwell invented a new phrase for the coming world order: the Cold War.
We may be heading not for general breakdown, but for an epoch as horribly stable as the slave empires of antiquity. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of world view, the kind of beliefs and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbours.
I think he thought that a society that possessed this extreme weapon would obviously be a society which would be able to concentrate power into a very few hands, because necessarily only a very few people would have control over this kind of deterrent, if it was a deterrent. And obviously those few people would be intimately connected with the political systems that were running that particular regime. And so this then concentrates power, military power, political power, which are almost indivisible, amongst a very, very tiny elite, which is not really displaceable. And so it would exacerbate any kind of autocratic tendencies that already existed in the regime.
In 1947, Orwell wrote in some detail about this, to him, possible future. His words read like a blueprint for the novel he was now writing.
That the fear inspired by the atomic bomb and other weapons yet to come will be so great that everyone will refrain from using them. This seems to me the worst possibility of all. It would mean the division of the world among 2 or 3 vast superstates, unable to conquer one another and unable to be overthrown by any internal rebellion. In all probability, their structure would be hierarchic, with a semi-divine caste at the top and outright slavery at the bottom, and the crushing out of liberty would exceed anything that the world has yet seen. Toward European Unity. Partisan Review, July 1947.
In 1984, the party has taken power after a decade of revolution in the 1950s and 1960s, a period when there's also been an atomic war. And it's this nuclear destruction that has forced the world's 3 superstates into a permanent state of Cold War, as revealed in the secret heretical book given to Winston Smith.
Atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s, and were first used on a large scale about 10 years later. At that time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped on industrial centres, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organised society, and hence of their own power. Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no more bombs were dropped.
As David Astor recalled, speaking in The Real 1984, Orwell's vision of the world's future was not something he recognised. At least, not at the time.
One of the few things he ever asked me about when he was writing 1984, he asked me, could I imagine a situation in the world where there were 3 world powers that dominated everything and were never at peace with each other, but never all at war at the same time, and you never knew if it was war or peace. I thought, well, that's an extraordinary idea. And I said, no, I couldn't imagine it, but it's very much what we've got, if you think of it. It's not far off it today.
Meanwhile, in the real world, outside his dystopia, Orwell was wrestling with whether there was another alternative besides nuclear conflagration or nuclear-armed Cold War in which one would either have to back the Russians or the Americans. Could the non-communist left, Orwell's left, find another way? Hugh Wilford.
there were a number of people around who thought that after the end of the war and the defeat of fascism and the general discrediting of the right, that there was scope for a sort of third force, a form of democratic socialism that would neither identify too much with the capitalist West nor with the communist Soviet Union. And this view was shared by Labour Party politicians, a number of trade unionists, and a number of literary intellectuals like Orwell and Koestler in Britain, but elsewhere as well, Camus in Paris, some of the New York intellectual crowd in the US like Dwight MacDonald. They're all talking about trying to do something radically different from what has been going on, a more humane sort of politics, one that's independent of these great power blocks.
In several articles in the late 40s, as he was writing 1984, Orwell set out an idea of a third way. As in a 1947 essay for the American anti-Stalinist magazine Partisan Review called Toward European Unity. How, Orwell asked himself, could the world avert the disasters of atomic war and Big Brother?
The only way of avoiding them that I can imagine is to present, somewhere or other, on a large scale, the spectacle of a community where people are relatively free and happy, and where the main motive in life is not the pursuit of money or power. In other words, democratic socialism must be made to work throughout some large area. But the only area in which it could conceivably be made to work in any near future is Western Europe.
But he ends by saying the actual outlook is very dark.
Dark and darker. The Cold War iced up the peoples and politics of the East and West, freezing out anything as feeble as a third way. America poured in martial aid to friendly states, and Stalin's Russia put the squeeze on Central Europe. With the Red Army by far the biggest military force on the continent, invasion of the West seemed quite possible.
The Soviet Union is installing friendly puppet governments in Eastern Europe. It instigates a coup in Czechoslovakia at the beginning of 1948, then imposes a blockade on West Berlin. There are real warfares in Western capitals, and this belief that Stalin's army, the Red Army, can just march in and subdue Europe.
Orwell wrote much of 1984 on a remote Scottish island. He retreated there to escape the pressures of London literary life, but as D.J. Taylor explains, there was another motive.
One of the reasons that he relocated himself to Jura, the remote Inner Hebridean island, in the late 1940s, because he thought it would be further enough away from the centre of some atomic explosion.
But politically, those like Orwell on the non-communist left had no obvious Jura to retreat to. To the Soviets and the Communists, they were simply the enemy. The capitalist Americans, however, were far more ecumenical than the Stalinists. They were very happy to have pro-democracy left-wingers in their cultural camp. Francis Stoner Saunders, author of Who Paid the Piper, the CIA and the Cultural Cold War.
By 1945-46, in the corridors of power in Washington in particular, the non-communist left has been identified as the group that needs to be embraced and, to a degree, one might argue, recruited, if you like, to the cause of sapping the communist claim to liberal democratic politics in Western Europe.
It was an emergency situation.
Hugh Wilford, author of Calling the Tune, the CIA, the British Left and the Cold War.
It's understandable, perhaps, why people who were attempting to maintain a democratic socialist point of view should nonetheless have eventually have felt the need to support the West, support the United States. Dwight MacDonald is another example of this. He eventually says that he chooses the West in 1950. I think Koestler talked about this as well, choosing the grey over the black.
Arthur Koestler comes back from America in, 1949, having spoken to all of the top security intelligence strategists as a kind of fully paid up member of the new card-carrying Cold Warrior non-communist left. Whether or not Orwell could have had a similar experience, he would certainly have been entertained by and embraced by the same political characters in Washington. I don't know. I would hope that he would have been more circumspect.
There it was, force majeure. In the real world, it was capitalist America against Stalinist Russia, one or the other. Labour's Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, had been an anti-communist for years and chose America, and so, by 1947, did Orwell. That summer, he wrote to Tribune to attack the magazine's equivocations over whether to support Bevin's stance. The letter was not published, but it's reproduced in Orwell's complete works.
In Defence of Comrade Ziliacus, Jura, summer 1947. Surely if one is going to write about foreign policy at all, there is one question that should be answered plainly. It is, if you had to choose between Russia and America, which would you choose? It will not do to give the usual quibbling answer, I refuse to choose. In the end, the choice may be forced upon us. We are no longer strong enough to stand alone, and if we fail to bring a Western European Union into being, we shall be obliged, in the long run, to subordinate our policy to that of one great power or the other. And in spite of all the fashionable chatter of the moment, everyone knows in his heart that we should choose America.
It's hard not to see another step towards 1984 here in the novel Britain is Airstrip 1, an outpost of a Burnhamite transatlantic superstate, Oceania. But the overriding enemy, the overriding target of his novel was totalitarianism, not just in the USSR, but any possibility of it back here at home. The Ziliacus letter was one of many attacks Orwell made while writing 1984 on fellow left-wingers he saw as pro-Soviet. It was part of an angry war of words with the Labour MP Connie Ziliacus, who was eventually expelled from his party for his opposition to the government's pro-American foreign policy.
Well, in a sense, my rebellion, as I see it, is directed to fundamentals, because the principle on which I have taken my stand is that a member of Parliament has two duties and not one duty. He has a loyalty as a member of Parliament to those who elected him.
I think the row between Orwell and Ziliacus is something that, incidentally, would have been incredibly useful to the cultural propagandists, the psychological, warfare strategists, if you like, because what they wanted was to have the left essentially sort of crack up and implode. To have someone like Orwell attack someone in the House of Commons and say he was a crypto-communist and should be exposed as one and should declare his real and true sympathies, which were to Soviet Russia. Incredibly incendiary, actually. I think what he's trying to do is to draw some of the sting, if you like, of these crypto-communists or Russophiles who are insisting that whatever's going on in the Soviet Union is anything other than a catastrophe and a total abuse of human rights and everything else. What Orwell's trying to do is say this has nothing to do with socialism. You cannot be on the left and make those arguments or make those claims to the Soviet Union.
Despite being at one with the Labour leadership over Russia, Orwell saw himself as being one of a few left-wingers who would make the fight against Stalinism central. This sense of fighting a precarious battle helped the seriously ill Orwell through the hard slog of finishing his novel. It also drove him to do something for which the creator of Big Brother and the Thought Police became posthumously notorious. In 1949, laid up in a Gloucestershire sanatorium, Orwell received a visit from a young friend. Orwell had met Celia Kirwan through her brother-in-law Arthur Koestler and had even at one point proposed to her.
I was asked to go, that's my job, and so I went. I was only too glad, you see, to get an excuse in the middle of a working week to go down to Gloucestershire and see George.
But this was not just a sympathy visit. Kirwan worked for something called the Information Research Department, a secret bureau in the Foreign Office set up by the Labour government to counter Soviet propaganda. And what Kirwan wanted was the names of people that Orwell thought should be asked to write for the IRD. But what he sent her was more than that. It was a list of those he thought should not be asked, on the basis of their unreliable and pro-Soviet views.
Poor George was in this awful hut in the sanatorium. It was awfully gloomy and depressing, really. And I just told him what IRD was doing, which he thoroughly approved of. But I said, can you give us these names? He gave me the names of the ones to ask to write, and then had the idea of sending me later, I think, names of ones not to write.
As parts of what had previously been free Europe were being swallowed up by communist control, the idea was to put out propaganda booklets which would advance the causes of the West in these territories. The important thing was that if you were going to get people to write them, the people who wrote them should be on your side. The problem at the time, of course, was that so many people's loyalties were occluded or equivocal, and it was in many cases impossible to work out just where left-wing fellow travellers were located. He was merely selecting names of people that he thought would be unsuitable for this particular task, and that's why I can never get particularly exercised by all of this.
Quite a few of the people that he mentioned did prove to be traitors. He didn't pick up all of them, and some certainly weren't.
It is very strange, by any account, to think of Orwell, who himself understood what censorship was because he'd come across it during the war. He understood what blacklisting was because Animal Farm had effectively been blacklisted during the war. I don't think he was naive to any of these mechanisms and the way in which these events occur. It is very strange that he should have handed over that list on the mere assumption that it might just be useful for the Foreign Office not to approach any of these people to write propaganda, without considering that possibly this could be construed in the future or used in the future as a kind of blacklist. It doesn't reflect on him well in any way. But, you know, listen, Orwell needs to be saved from those who would beatify him, because he never made any claims to be a saint. And the list, what it demonstrates to us, is that at the end of his life, he got caught up in something that was much bigger than him and grew to be much bigger than him. And I think, had he lived, he might have regretted it. I think he might have regretted it the moment he handed it over.
In 1949, 1984 was finally published as Orwell lay dying in hospital. Its impact was extraordinary. It was widely seen as an attack not just on communism, but on aspects of the Labour government. After all, the totalitarian party in the book is called INGSOC, English Socialism, and at the time, Labour's opponents routinely refer to them as the Socialists. DJ Taylor.
Orwell knew that 1984 in particular was going to be used as a stick by which the left across Europe would be beaten by anybody who wanted to beat them throughout the years after his death. The American novelist Sidney Sheldon wrote to Orwell suggesting that 1984 be adapted for the Broadway stage, but saying to him that what was already being interpreted in America as simply a straightforward attack on communism seemed to him to be an attack on autocracy in general. And Orwell wrote back to him saying that, yes, he was right. It was an anti-totalitarian book.
He did write, of course, very clearly to Francis Henson, who was the educational director of the United Automobile Workers in the USA, to say it is not an attack on socialism or the British Labour Party, of which I am a supporter. It shows up the perversions to which a centralised
economy is liable, and which have already been partly realised in communism and fascism.
But fascism had been defeated. The actual totalitarianism the world faced called itself socialist. In 1948, in an essay for Politics and Letters called Writers and Leviathan, Orwell attacked as schizophrenic the way that nearly the whole of the English left has been driven to accept the Russian regime as socialist, while silently recognising that its spirit and practice are quite alien to what is meant by socialism in this country. Which is as good a definition as any of the doublethink of 1984. In a statement from Orwell, initialled by his publisher Fred Warburg, he had written that if the Labour government broke down in the face of the problems it confronted, tougher types would take power. On the left, he warned,
the younger generation is suspect, and the seeds of totalitarian thought are probably widespread among them.
Orwell died with Stalin and Beria still in the Kremlin and show trials happening in Eastern Europe. I think he decided, in effect, that the anti-totalitarian battle left little space in the end for his kind of socialism. That's why his dictators were called the English Socialists. With Orwell dead, 1984 became an enormously powerful cultural weapon in a Cold War that lasted for another 40 years. Western governments and agencies funded its distribution and filming, and it also formed part of the arsenal of the right and centre-right against most forms of socialism. Not that the ideas and writing in 1984 died with the end of the Cold War. The book was far too powerful for that. George Orwell's grave bears only his real name, Eric Arthur Blair, and the dates of his birth and death, 1903, 1950. His real monument, though, is 1984, And if it needs an epitaph, how about the last line of his last public statement about his last book? The scene of the book is laid in Britain in order to emphasise that the English-speaking races are not innately better than anyone else, and that totalitarianism, if not fought against, could triumph anywhere.